in as we get things going. Appreciate everyone being here in person and online. You're going to see less formality to this meeting. We're not going to be following Robert's rules. Figure a public forum doesn't need, full control system in that way. But I wanted to run through real quick the goal of tonight, what we're aiming to do, kind of set the expectation, and then turn it over to Patrick to kind of walk us through the presentation, of which I'm sure I'll interrupt a number of times to add unnecessary color. For anyone who hasn't had the opportunity, Patrick Lawler is our new assistant town administrator. He joined us June 1st, is already an amazing asset and individual. I look forward to the continued opportunity to work with him, and I encourage folks to get to know him and understand what he can bring to the town, because he can bring a lot. He comes to us by way of Andover. He was for the last 10 years? 8. All right, so tonight, why is Nick doing this? Because we have a big thing in front of us, and I think that big things deserve to be talked about repeatedly. And as my board and people who have talked to me before understand, I can be a bit verbose. And doing this all in one select board meeting seemed a bit cumbersome. So taking the opportunity to do this in its own right gives us the opportunity to have the discussion in and of itself. It gives us the opportunity to kind of have BCAT record it and create the fodder for the continued conversation as we move forward. We're having this conversation because we have big projects in front of us, right? We just recently approved a new elementary school, Fox Hill, and we also recently approved a new police station. And we have in front of us the high school as a project that is going to be looming on everyone's minds and will certainly be the most expensive project this town may have undertaken, hands down. This conversation is not about the high school specifically. This is more of an overarching education as to what is Proposition 2.5 regarding law, right? And what is debt exclusions, or what are debt exclusions as they pertain to Proposition 2.5. So that way we all fully understand what we're walking into as the building committee, as these dollars start to hit our bottom line, our taxes, right? So again, this is meant to be educational. This is meant to be a conversation. So please, online, raise your hands, and I'll do my best to keep an eye out. In the room, obviously, raise your hand, and we'll engage in conversation. And I think it's also important to state that this is not in any way meant to attack any of the projects, right? I think that information is important. Being educated as a whole, as a community, is important. And that's why we're doing this, right? And I hope as big conversations continue to happen, we can do more of these town halls, right? And actually have a purpose to get together and have conversations. So let's go ahead and get into it, and take it from there. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I've been with the town for 13 days, and I already get to make a presentation about taxes, so that's always exciting to me. No sarcasm there. That's the honest truth here. So tonight, we'll talk about Proposition 2.5, what it means, how it works, and we'll look at how we build the tax levy, so how we determine what amount will be paid from taxation from the from residential and personal property and commercial taxes. Through that, we'll talk about how we build the levy and how it comes into play, particularly here in Burlington, the classes of property that make up our tax bill or our tax levy, the process by which we set the tax rate, and then we'll wrap up. I'll sort of talk about what I call the project financing life cycle, or the process by which the finance department is involved in a major project, sort of the milestones from the financial end, and some of the steps that are required to take for a larger project. And then while you can You're encouraged to interrupt as we go through. We'll have some dedicated time at the end for questions and discussion, but please feel free to interrupt at any time. So, sorry. We'll dive right into understanding Proposition 2.5. And I can't get it to quite go how I, okay, here we go. So Proposition 2.5, it is a Massachusetts law that was passed in 1980 that places limits on the amount of property taxes a community can raise through taxation in any given year. What that means is the tax levy from the prior year includes an automatic 2.5% increase. So as you build the levy, one of the elements of that is building that tax levy limit increase of 2.5%, which is where the law gets its name. And so, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the tax levy includes taxes from residential properties, so what is paid on a monthly basis, or if you have, different structure with your property tax, your mortgage, you may pay it once a year, you may pay it twice a year. And that levy, or how the entire taxable property in town comes from residential taxes, commercial taxes, and personal property taxes. So those come down to two real major areas, the residential and the commercial and industrial and personal property. Oftentimes, and given the case here in Burlington, that levy is composed of segments of taxable property at different rates. So there's the residential rate, there's a commercial, industrial, personal property rate, and how that is calculated is pretty interesting, and how the different classes of property or the different classes of property value end up building to what's done here is a split rate, but it all starts with getting a single rate when you're developing the split between residential and property tax and commercial property taxes. That starts with developing a single rate, and then from there is where you calculate the taxable value based on where the select board, which is a tax setting authority, how they develop the rates by which per $1,000 of the taxation you come to a rate that is based on, $1,000, a rate per $1,000 of value. So property tax year over year increases by that 2.5%, and it also increases by the amount of new growth in that year. So the new growth can vary from if you're putting a bathroom renovation together, or you're adding siding to your property. All of those things are taxable. They come to new growth, which is essentially the value of that new construction or property that might be added in a year. So, like I said, it can vary from adding, a few $1,000s of taxable value that you maybe increase if it's a bathroom addition or a new kitchen. And then if we were to see a larger development, or, whether that be property, residential property, or a major commercial expansion, those things can significantly increase the amount of new growth, which residential taxpayers aren't paying new growth in the commercial property tax. They all stay within that classification of property. So that makes a big difference when you're talking about new growth and who's going to pay the taxes on that. It's distributed amongst those classes of property. So there could be years where we have an enormous amount of commercial growth, but very little residential growth. The additional new growth is taxed on that class of property, not residential. So we're still not done in building that tax levy. So additional elements to the tax levy may include a debt exclusion. So a debt exclusion is an increase of the tax levy for a finite amount of time. So if we're borrowing $150 million for a project, we can do that through a debt exclusion, which is an increase to the levy specifically for the purpose of raising funds. And then in addition to that, there's override. An override is the permanent increase to a tax levy. So a debt exclusion only raises property tax for the term of the debt that you're taking on. And so what town meeting approves is the idea that a debt exclusion or exempt debt, and some call it, is going to be undertaken, but it doesn't actually speak to the amount that it may be. So we could have a $100 million project and the debt service costs are an interest of 5.5%, or they can be, if it's a good year, 3%. Town meeting doesn't dictate what percentage that we're borrowing at. They only dictate that the approval of a debt exclusion itself. And so in addition to debt exclusions, we have overrides, which are permanent increases to the tax levy. Both of these require town meeting ballot box approval, a certain threshold of the select board to put it on a ballot, and overrides are permanent increases to the tax levy unless an underride is passed, which does the opposite. It reduces the amount that a community can be taxed or a community can tax. And so, when Proposition 2.5 began, the idea was that a community would probably have a operating override like every 10 years. And that was sort of the conceptual part of the group that put this together, that, okay, we're capping the amount that can be raised by taxation in any given year. It's also an opportunity to manage the taxation through an underride. Underrides are pretty uncommon. Overrides are pretty common too. Burlington has not had an operating override since it would Proposition. That's it. Correct. And there's very few communities that have never had one. A lot of it is built into some sort of model where they'll plan on doing an override every 5 years or every 3 years. And to not have an override, and we didn't have one ever in Andover, I just worked, it's a pretty big deal that you're able to sustain that level of taxation through what we often see as, costs increasing every year that may be more than a 2.5% increase or new growth. So I actually think that's something to be proud of as a community, that we've been able to maintain within the levy. It also presents its own challenges, right? Because there's not a mechanism to increase beyond that, and there's a bunch of different schools of thought around that about whether it's good to not have an override. A community that has the amount of excess levy capacity that we have here in Burlington, it would not be indicative that an override is required in the next 3 years or so. So things have been set up well that an override combined with double-digit excess levy capacity would not really make a whole lot of sense, because you'd ideally want to use all of your levy before a debt exclusion. Oh, I'm sorry, an override. So, as we talk about building the levy, and I'm hoping that this comes up now. So this part of it is good to illustrate. It's not letting me do it one at a time.
Can you turn this longer for some?
I don't know if it has a.
That one doesn't have a, that one's flat to the wall.
Right? We'll bring back the big one that's out in the middle of the room. That one might turn. Want to turn this one?
Different.
Looks like it's got a little bit of capability.
Yeah.
What am I doing? Oh, yeah, I need to do it that way, huh?
So that was a lot packed into one slide. While they're working on that, does anybody have any initial questions regarding, any of the breakdown of what we're talking about? What the tax levy is, why debt exclusion, anything like that? Just looking for hands.
All right, so what we'll look at next here is building the tax levy, even though ideally this would have been animated to bring in one at a time, but that's okay. So we've got the prior year, so FY25 tax levy. That is what was raised but on taxation for 25. And then there's an automatic 2.5% increase to that. And then an application of new growth. And during this time in the budget process, we don't know exactly what's going to be there for new growth. This is often done by looking at a 10-year average. It's looked at by taking the last year and applying some sort of percentage to it. But these are things, at least the new growth is not known to us at this point. So right there is an estimate. And then if we look at the excess levy capacity, that's the amount that Burlington could tax, but is choosing not to. So that's what I was speaking about earlier, that it wouldn't necessarily make sense to have an override if you have excess levy capacity. And right now, that levy capacity is $12,410,000. And that brings us to the total levy to $168,758. There shouldn't be a 1 there. My apologies on that. So what this means is that based on the prior year levy, 2.5% increase and new growth, we could technically tax $168,758,000. And what this now includes too is any revenue that could be there from a debt exclusion. We don't have any of that on the books right now, but essentially this is what I was speaking about, that requires a 2/3 majority approval at town meeting and a simple majority approval at the ballot box. And revenue from debt exclusions taxes can only be raised for the life of the borrowing term. So it's not a permanent addition to the levy. If this is borrowed at for 15 years, then it's only going to be available revenue for that 10 years. And sometimes the taxation of something isn't always done on one issuance or debt issuance, which we'll look at a little bit later on, is how the timing of this can vary. So that is how we build the tax levy. And as we look at the classes of property, which I mentioned earlier, residential, and then what is often referred to as CIP, commercial, industrial, and personal property. So the property is classified into those classes of property, and then the tax bills are developed after the tax rate is set, and that is done as a split tax rate, which there's a different value between the taxable property for residential and the commercial, industrial, personal property. And how this is determined first is, we take the levy, so we take what we're going to be taxing for property, and you then divide what that would be as a single rate. So some communities have just one rate, and it's a lot easier to set the tax rate that way. And this approach, which at this point is probably the majority of communities in Massachusetts, there's a calculation process based on that split rate development and then adjusting it as you start to shift over to those other classes of property. That's how you develop the calculation related to what the split tax rate ultimately can be. So, it's always kind of a funny situation when you're in the tax development process or setting the tax rate. So in May of 2025, the town meeting is approving the next year's budget. So, and that's done in May, and you're approving the budget for the next year. And then, so right now, that is straddling just one fiscal year, but really two. You're in one fiscal year, you're planning for the next one, and then a few months later, we're able to generate how much new growth has occurred in the last fiscal year. So during this part, we are certifying the tax growth as well as free cash or any funds that were in any free cash. We have to certify that every single year, and that tells us how much we were able to collect in that year above and beyond the budget, or the amount of expenses that we budgeted for but didn't incur. So that has to happen in that September to October timeframe in order to have that submitted and returned to us from the Department of Revenue to understand how much is actually going to be taxed. And that process of the tax classification occurs in November, and it is actually funding what was already occurred at town meeting. So you're funding the 2026 appropriation, but you're closing out 2025, and you're likely planning for 2027. So you're in the middle of, well, you're in a part of 3 fiscal years you're dealing with at once. And so only after the shift is set, that's when we actually are able to send out tax bills that aren't preliminary. So the first two fiscal year tax bills are generally estimates, and then you get your final tax bill, which has to be distributed by December 31st of every year. Otherwise, you're not able to tax that property at the value that you have set it. It has to be out by 12/31, or the bills remain preliminary and you might have a cash flow problem. But the idea is to endeavor not for that to be an issue.
Right. And this is why every November, the select board sets the tax rate. We try and explain, at least from the tax levy to the tax rate. That way, if folks are tuning in, they understand, how it flows from town meeting in May down through the summer and the fall to November was the tax rate. And that really, for a number of years now, it's been, a cost of doing business increase that happens on an annual basis. And that's where we're seeing our taxes raise that $250 to $300 range, the last at least 8 years that's been going up. That's us covering our operating budget. That's us covering the cost of doing business as a municipality. And when folks say, well, hey, lower my taxes, I say, hey, what services do you want to cut? Right? Because that's the trade-off, right? Is that we have to really start to say, well, do we want to lose things if we want to lower taxes? I think the answer is always no, right? We're very fortunate in Burlington to say we have a lot of services with a pretty low tax rate as it is. Adam, don't do that. he's like, we could lower the taxes. But that's the reality of the situation. But to Patrick's point, we're very fortunate as a community, right, to be in this situation. But I think that when we start saying things like that exclusion, when we start saying the town has to vote, to build a new high school or to do this, people start to conjure up certain things, and automatically we say, well, I don't want my taxes to go up, right? And so, no, I'm not going to vote no on that, even though we might need it. It's X amount of dollars, and no, don't raise my taxes. So, again, that's why we're having this conversation, and hopefully between now and when we have, that vote, we'll keep having it. So,
Excellent. So now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the financing life cycle for a major project and some of the things that specifically the finance team and the town administrator's office does along the way with those project financing.
Patrick, before you get into that, I see a hand up, so I want to
Oh, yeah.
recognize, I see Andrea Tracy. I'm going to go ahead and request so you can come off mute. I see your hand up. You should be able to come off mute and ask your question. Andrea?
Andrea, can you hear us?
I just sent the request again to see if. All right. If not, you can always put your hand back up and come back to it. All right, Patrick, go ahead.
All right. Hold on one second. Okay, so,
Mute your speaker.
yeah. Never know which to mute. All right, the next is, we're going to talk a little bit about project financing life cycle from the perspective of the finance team here. So the first area for a large project, or really any project, but what will drive this is the ultimate cost of something is a feasibility study. This is often done alongside a schematic design process. So in this process, there's a needs assessment, there's a suitability measurement of the site. Is it something that we can accomplish on a particular site? What will the project accomplish overall, and some of the expected challenges that one site might have over another, depending on is the property or the project at the property, does it have water, does it have issues on the site related to conservation? Are we abutting wetlands? Are we going to have to make wetland compensation to provide wetland mitigation in other places? A lot of times the project financing, the feasibility study is paid for either from taxation or just cash related to the project, and that can be done through free cash, that can be done through cash capital sources. And the reason why oftentimes this is not part of the borrowing cost right away is that feasibility studies, designs can only be borrowed for a 5-year period. If the project is then approved, you can roll that in most cases into a longer-term project budget. But oftentimes to get these funded, it is done through free cash or cash capital. If there's a feeling that, hey, this may not get approval and we don't want to borrow for $1.5 million and have a huge debt service cost related to that. So that's one strategy when it comes to feasibility. And then we look at the design process. Again, this is oftentimes part of the previous process. Architectural firms, professional estimators begin to refine project cost estimates. This is often where projects sort of make or break. If you have an idea about what particular project cost might be in the community and then it comes back $100 million more, this is sometimes an area that will sort of derail a project based on those designed, detailed price estimates. Also during this time, architectural drawings are refined so that we have a better idea of what it's going to take to build a project, and the development of the construction documents that add to the sort of legitimacy of a design and provides more information in that process to really bring the design costs and the construction costs together so that town meeting has more of an idea of what they will be approving or not approving. And then, as I mentioned, the approval or abandonment of a project based on some of the answers that are generated. A project is then brought to town meeting. If town meeting approves that, the borrowing authorization is granted. So town meeting approval related to the debt issuance happens at this phase. We also are working with our financial advisors to make sure that we have a better idea about what the market cost for selling debt is, how many borrowing element, how many issuances are going to go into this. You know, for a $150 million project, which you'll see in a few minutes, it's not going to be just one issuance. There's actually laws based on how much you can borrow and then how much you have to spend from that borrowing term, because somebody who came up with the idea that we don't want to borrow $150 million and put it in the bank on non-taxable debt. So there's a sort of a timeline that has to occur of spending down the debt service. At the same time, it is likely that we will have to go to our rating agency. So in Burlington's case, the most recent rating agency utilization has been through S&P Global, and that helps us determine our credit worthiness, which has a direct correlation to how much debt is going to cost us to issue. And then, so we start the borrowing process, and part of that process here is the actual debt issuance process. So at this point, we go to market and sell our debt, and this is a process that has to be done through a sort of bid process that requires us to award to the firm that has the best net interest costs. So that creates competition, right, to get the lowest interest rate in other terms. And we're AAA. So the highest rating from the S&P Global Ratings is what Burlington's credit rating is. So, you know, this is a big process. We work with a municipal service securities broker, and they gather the tons of property that we have information in our official statement. They have a ton of information on our budget, our results from our budget, the local economy, and then a whole lot of background on our economy and the current state of the economy and what may be changing. And so then the debt issue is finalized, and then the select board actually sign the documents for the borrowing plan. And that is not always done at one time. Well, they sign the loan documents, but then that debt doesn't necessarily have to be borrowed at any certain time frame, other than the time frame I talked about with the prior steps. And so, yes?
Are bond anticipation notes, or that figure restored, is that all part of the same process?
Yes, so if, and so we can, it can be. It's not necessarily always a debt anticipation note. It depends on what time of the year is being borrowed, or the debt is being borrowed, and if it's going to create a deficit. So a lot of times when we have an approval for spending and borrowing, we may not borrow it all at that time. We may do a bond anticipation note so that the debt strategy around it sort of approaches the best financing plan for it. So there's not always a bond anticipation note. The only time that you really might do that is if you're not going to close the year with a deficit as a result of that. So a bond anticipation note is a form of short-term borrowing that you use to resolve any potential deficits from the project. So we may be incurring costs in the example here of a $150 million bond, but we are not going to get started until a certain time, or we have proceeds from another debt issuance that we can cover with that. And usually a bond anticipation note is a 6-month term, sometimes sooner. And they are changing the rules a little bit about deficits. So it used to be you had to resolve deficits through bond anticipation notes by July or June 30th, and Mass DOR has recently changed that to it's not counted against you until September 30th. So oftentimes that's just enough time to get cash flow from the first sort of collection of taxes. So what we have here is just an example of what it would look like at a $150 million project. For example, in this situation, we have 2 authorizations, and that's for, in this case, a feasibility study to understand what the costs of the project are going to be, and then the authorization for the actual design and construction of a project. So in this case, there are 2 authorizations to meet the full cost of the project. And then the financing schedule. So this is that area where we may be borrowing 3 to 5 times in order to make sure that we're getting the best rate. And so sometimes if we borrow all of this on issuance number 1, we aren't necessarily hedging rate interest changes, and we may be on a schedule that doesn't permit us to borrow the full cost of it, so that we don't create any issues where we're in an arbitrage situation, so we're earning more than we're spending. That's kind of a new problem that we've had in the last couple of years. It hasn't always been the case, but with interest rates pretty high for cash, we're running into that. So in this situation, we would have $10 million for site enabling, so getting a project ready, getting the land up to standards we need it, utility work, those things that are done before construction begins. And then in this situation, we borrow 3 more times at $50 million per issuance, which ultimately gets us to that $150 million mark. And again, there's only so much that you can borrow at one time, and this helps us get through that. So we covered a lot in a little time, so if there's any questions or discussion or anything that is a burning desire to resolve about municipal finance? That's okay.
It's a lot to take in.
I'll defer to you. I mean, I'll give like my Jerry Springer final thought. But I want to hear the people online first, if there are people online.
I'm not seeing any hands go up right now.
So I'll just shoot from the hip here.
Yeah,
I think you're really showing leadership here by getting out in front and explaining what this is. And it's been done in very general terms tonight. And I think it's been done, but I think it's been done with a level of professionalism and a level of education forward, and knowledge-based approach that we can take forward to people that were being communicative with what's happening. There's still a lot of baseball left to be played, and when I saw the numbers projected on the screen, it wasn't specific to a project or a school or a police building, or there's a lot of wood to chop here. Mm-hmm. But I do get a perception tonight that, again, I applaud you for your leadership, and I do feel there's a tremendous level of professionalism at the town level. This gentleman just came in less than 2 weeks ago, and the level of knowledge he's embraced in that limited time Give me tremendous confidence. We still have a lot of wood to chop, though, and this is going to be an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely.
This is the first salvo in an ongoing conversation.
100%. Thank you, Adam.
I would agree with that. But we're not the only audience that has to be convinced.
Correct.
And I felt like I was back in college in Echo 101, saying, what in the world is he talking about? And I've been on town meeting for 30 years now, and been through this before, so thank you very much for the explanation. I still learned a few things along the way, but there are a lot of people who haven't seen this or haven't given it a thought. And I'm talking about people who may have to vote on this, your average town person.
Right.
So I think one of the goals that we're going to do as town meeting members is understand it and be able to talk to our constituents. But I think we're going to have to simplify this process.
Yep.
I think you already know that. Here we're talking out of school here.
No.
But this is a good first step, to be sure.
Yeah.
We're talking about a particular debt. Is there a particular term that we're looking at? Is it always 15, is it 30? We have our choice, and we stretch it out, tighten it up? Things like that.
In many situations, you can't, there's limits based on how long you can borrow for. So, for example, like a school building, you can likely do 30 years. Water main replacement, you can do up to 40 years. Then, when we talk about vehicles, they don't want you borrowing for 15 years on a vehicle that's going to last 5 or 10. And that's an interesting point, too, because there's been a lot of changes in the lifetime or the life cycle, I guess we're using that term again, of a vehicle. You can, if we're buying an F-150, it may be better to pay cash with that. You can probably plan to borrow for something like that as much as 10 years. It's a little bit of a harder sell. But like some of our large vehicles, like a fire engine, you can borrow 20 years. So these vehicles that are going to be useful, the useful life, you often have to certify that too. So you may say, oh, I want to do this over a 10-year term, and bond counsel or the attorneys that work with the town have to approve that, and sometimes we have to certify, like, yes, we really think this is going to be a 10-year plus asset. So, but to your earlier point about, the information around this and the need to become more specific and reach greater audiences, the time will be right for particular projects to do that. But happy to talk to any group of people, constituency, that want to learn more about this or, ask questions they might not usually get a chance to ask. So we're on board with that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, communication is 100% of the game, right? I know that because again, we can contextualize this with the high school building project. So for a moment I will, but the high school building committee was before the select board last week, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was, and communication was a big part of the conversation, and they are working towards getting information out to the community at large and trying to find as many opportunities for that. I think that, we still have the opportunity to move the Fox Hill and police station to debt exclusion. Right? We could decide to put that on the ballot and have the town vote on that, right? Move it out of the operating budget altogether.
No. Was that already decided upon?
Now, you mentioned the operating budget is a distraction because you always have to pay the interest on the bonds. The only thing by adding to a debt exclusion is it helps raise the levy.
Right.
Debt exclusion doesn't.
Mentioning that operating budget does not help the discussion.
Sorry. You're right. Thank you.
You're going to pay for it one way or
One way or the other, we pay for it.
Hold on. Debt exclusions don't raise the levy limit. They take the debt out of the 2.5 calculation. So that's why it's called an exclusion.
Right.
So if we take a project that we already are paying for in the operating budget and then exclude it, you take the cost of that project out of the 2.5 calculation. So you're still raising taxes. So it's on your tax levy, but it's not part of the 2.5 calculation. That's why it's called an exclusion.
So I conflate it with the operating budget, right? But we can all see how quickly even people who have talked about this for the last year can easily misspeak, right? I think.
Thank you for making my point.
right. So
Even in the last 5 minutes, we got confused, and to your point, we've been talking about this for years.
exactly.
So we take this out to the great public, it's going to go sideways real fast.
Right. And so I think having consistent message from all parties is key. We got approval from town meeting to hire a communications director, right? So, what is that going to look like, right? What role can that person serve? We have the Burlington Buzz, right? And they are very much interested in making sure that the community is aware of what's going on. Opportunities like this to get together and keep having that
I just want to be clear on one thing. We don't have the Burlington Buzz. The Burlington Buzz is an asset to the community.
Correct.
And I'm not like, I just want to be clear, I went to school.
Parse my words out.
And I'm not trying to, the Burlington Buzz is a third-party source.
Correct.
That provides, they're not like a media wing of the town.
No, they are not. That
As is BCAT.
As is BCAT, correct. They are not affiliated with the town, not funded by the town through any means that we would control them, right? They are third-party communications platforms
But they're
that
good
have
resources
correct.
for
They're
us.
great resources for us to gather information from.
And so it is to, at this point, there are a number of channels out there, some of them through the town, some of them independent. It would be in everybody's best interest to make those channels more widely known.
Right.
Because I would bet if I interviewed 100 people off the street, that, you know what the Burlington Buzz is? Maybe 10 would know, and I think that's a shame.
Right.
Cadillac does a great job. As an independent voice, that's certainly necessary. But we need to help the general public understand the information that's available to them in as accurate a way as possible.
Right.
Because this is going to become a very emotional issue, and misinformation is poison.
Absolutely.
So, I want to avoid that.
Yep. Taking a look online to see if any hands have gone out. They have not. Anything else you want to talk about?
This is a good form. What could possibly from us?
Right,
This
yeah.
is a good first form.
Got to start somewhere,
Yeah.
right? It's a big bite of the apple.
I'd like to just propose an idea, and I heard this in actually a radio interview a couple days ago. And the notion of a pre-mortem as opposed to post-mortem after something, project has failed, what went wrong? So pre-mortem, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, is say, before you begin, how could this go sideways? How can this fail? What are all the possible problems that we're going to find? And then deal with it accordingly. And in the interest of the Burlington public, at the center of our attention. And a high school has certain value. A police station has a certain value. DPW station has a certain value. Getting water from the NWI has a certain value. Okay. What can go wrong? Okay, interfere with that benefit. And let's deal with those problems and discuss those problems first, which is what this meeting is the first step. We're joining that and applauding it. There's more work to be done, more discussion to be had. What I would like to suggest that we think in those terms.
I like it.
And then move forward.
Okay. Just trying to give folks the opportunity to want to raise their hand. All right. I see no one online looking to ask any further questions. Anything else anyone wants to add?
When's the next one?
Great question. Honestly, I think it's going to be dependent on, paying attention to what the high school building committee is doing, and then kind of seeing how things progress towards September. I think that we'll get a lot of life out of this conversation in terms of, replayability on BCAT and, other places. So I would say stay tuned.
So, returning back to one of your initial comments, to have this discussion not necessarily focused on the high school.
Right.
And be a more general discussion. Is there a possibility or have you given any thought to putting this kind of information on the town website,
Yeah.
separate from the page of the Building High School, but just in general, from finance department or wherever? So here's how we're shepherding people's money. Here's the process. Simplify. Beginning the slide deck. Some people will get it. Others, they have to spin it in a different way. But people are used to going to the website for information. Some people are used to going to BCAT, but not everybody.
Right.
Not all just BCAT. Not everybody watches BCAT. Website's a little more accessible.
Yep.
7 pages, section, whatever. Here's where your money goes. And we don't have that in one space now, but I think this discussion might be a good first step towards that.
Yeah. And I think, Dave is a great point, right? We've got roughly 17,000 registered voters. We know there aren't 17,000 folks subscribed to the Buzz or 17,000 people, subscribed to BCAT, right? So, how can we reach the people who aren't, right? And that's, we've been wrestling that question for years,
That's the
right?
conversation.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe we'll start a TikTok channel or something. I don't know. But anyways, I appreciate everyone coming in person and online.
Yeah.
We'll keep folks posted as we, engage in more of these and hope to see you guys again. Thanks so much. I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you.
All right.
Said that.
Good night to all those online. Thank you for joining us.